hopefully what we can do is talk a little bit about the genesis of 1969 and what the goals were. But I think also in the current moment, where it feels like 1969 all over again, I think it would be very interesting to meditate on, what's relevant about 1969, the year, the piece, the musical works, and maybe talk a little bit about what one might have done if 1969 were being written today. So we can start anywhere in that whole field of possibility. Maybe somebody wants to talk briefly about the original stimulus for 1969.
Yeah, I guess I could take that, since it started with the brainstorm that I had, gosh, I can't remember how many years ago, but a long time ago, to bring disparate music together in some way that feels organic. And so I had this brainstorm to take a moment in time and look at all the music, like gather together all the music that was happening at that moment in time, and then find a way to tell a story about it. I think I made a list of like 5 different years, and just like years where there were interesting confluxes of music being written simultaneously. And I remember I had this list of years and music, and had a conversation with our Guzlinian at Carnegie Hall at that point, and we started talking it through. And when we got to 1969, and I'd already stumbled on this anecdote of the meeting that was supposed to have happened between John Lennon and Karlheinz Stockhausen. And it was actually Ara who said, "Man, that's a really cool story. I think you should just do a show about that. That should be the show." And I just love the idea.
That initial anecdote really, I thought, captured one of the essential things about that time, which is this sort of loopy idealism that we can do anything, we're going to break down barriers, we're going to change the world, we're going to take on the establishment, all of that. So you had all of our musical heroes, which besides John Lennon and Yoko Ono and the rest of the Beatles and Stockhausen and Berio and Leonard Bernstein, they each were trying to do new things, and they were all quite idealistic. And at some point, they each discovered politics and turned their art to that. And they all were kind of pilloried for it. So this notion of the meeting that never happened, the revolutionary change that didn't quite come off, that seemed to be sort of like a metaphor for the loopy idealism of the 60s. It's like, well, what happens when you try to change the world and you don't? Well, it might not happen then, but as happened with the music that these people were working with, in time, change did happen. So that, I think, is something that definitely carries through to today, when we're feeling like this tremendous angst and frustration and worry about what is going to happen. What does art mean in the context of a world where art seems to be a luxury? And I think the story of these people says that, well, it's more than a luxury. It can be a guidepost for us as well.
Thanks. That's great. Let me go back to you, Alan, because one of the things that I think is most distinctive about 1969, of course, and it was, I imagine, at the base of what you were doing, was the set of music, the pieces of music that you bring in. So did you start with, okay, guys, I want to do these pieces, can you write a theater piece around them? Or did the logic of the story that Andrew just laid out sort of make you put works of art in, or music that you hadn't otherwise thought of?
It was somewhere between the two. I started with a very long list of music from 1969, which included everything that ended up in the show, but also Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, and the Ligeti Concerto, and Philip Glass's Music and Similar Motion. So I started with that, but also with the idea of telling the story that would be centered on the Stockhausen-Lennon meeting. Like, it was very clear to me from the beginning that the musical choices should follow the storytelling and the choices, and that like it wasn't going to be about like what is my favorite music from 1969.
And I think that was the right decision to take. And the other thing, which nobody's mentioned, which we should mention, that all the text comes from original sources. And that was one of the challenges of writing and putting it together, was we're trying to tell a story, but we're only trying to tell it with original source material.
But it was a huge challenge. And, you know, I remember at the point we brought Andy in, we had this like mountain of source material to which Andy added a bunch of his own. But as Nigel said, you know, it didn't, how it all fit together was just this like enormous, very daunting puzzle.
And also with the added challenge that while we hired a few professional actors to voice major roles, most of the dialogue is voiced by musicians. These, the members of the ensemble, if they don't have an instrument in their mouth, they're usually saying something. So, and that was challenging. I know
well, that's a great lead-in to talk about casting and you know, the kind of, I think Andrew brings up a really interesting point, which kind of bedevils the classical music world, which is that classical musicians, music instrumentalists especially, are specialists who have often, they're not real theatrical. In fact, it's often been kind of trained out of them to do anything else other than play their instrument and to call attention to themselves, bad things. So I guess maybe I would love to hear a little bit about what you thought the challenges were to getting these musicians to be actors.
So, I mean, we had, there's sort of two parts to that question, because, or two potential answers. I mean, one is that I had already worked with the group for how long, I don't know how many years before this came along. So we had the advantage that we had, as a group, done, I'm always wary of this word theatrical, because I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. I'm going to just say heightened performative work. We had done heightened performative work that had included largely movement before that. So the group as a whole were, if not acclimatized, but they were, it was not a completely new thing for them to have to do stuff that was slightly out of the bailiwick of just traditional performance, musical performance. But they're doing something outside their comfort zone, and they're using skills that they don't use as musical performers, and technique.
And I'll add to that, that Nigel is really a master at doing that kind of work with musicians. And it is like, for me, it's a delight in rehearsal to watch Nigel like grapple with the performers, you know, one at a time, like draw these performances out of them. Everybody in the ensemble has a part to play, and some of them are, you know, not as big as the roles that we hired professional actors for, but like, you know, have to hold their own against them.
And the thing that you said, Robert, as well, I think is very important. We weren't trying to do like a drag show of impersonation of these figures. I mean, you know, you have the sense of Stockhausen, but you don't get, he's not meant to be Stockhausen in some sort of fundamentally transformative way.
We started with the idea that the only actors would be Lennon and Stockhausen. But then I remember we had some, like, it took a while to accept that, at least for me to accept that, like, Berio really needed to be a third actor and not something that I would like occasionally like turn around while conducting voice.
No, and I think in the finished piece, Berio is very important. Yeah, and the because of the kind of writing that he did, I mean, he comes across as a very late 60s kind of, you know, almost like a Fellini-esque figure. You know, he's got like he's very talky and articulate, and kind of, I think the way the piece evolved, and especially maybe in contemporary perspective, Berio becomes quite pivotal. I mean, I have to say, like, yeah, Stockhausen's clearly an important guy, but in the current context, the sort of struggles that Berio had around race and things like that seemed to come closer to the center. And Stockhausen's kind of crazy new age thing is interesting, but maybe less it's Bernstein and Berio to me who are now like at the heart of what 1969
I would agree. I would agree.
today.
The reason why Berio had to have his own actor was that the first iterations of the play, we really kind of missed him. He was certainly chatty and like an immense grise, but he didn't really have, politically, he didn't have a skin in the game, because we hadn't yet come across Traces, which is the opera that he wrote about, as he called it, black and white violence, which of course is what helps resonate today. I guess after the first round, we felt, a little dissatisfied with how his story played out. So I went looking for it. There's a Berio archives, I think in Switzerland. And while I was trying to set up an appointment to go there, they pointed out to me that an American scholar had recently been there and was researching Berio's American years. And it turns out he had just gotten a commission from the Library of Congress to create a chamber piece for them that would be performed at the library. And in the meantime, he went out to start teaching at Mills College in Oakland. And while he was there, he discovered politics, which in Oakland was the politics of race. So he got this idea of writing this opera about it. And the original, his notion of the chorus would be, I think it was it Howard University chorus, which would be, they were black and half of them were going to appear in whiteface. So when the script was presented to the Library of Congress, they said basically no way, and so it was never performed. The score ended up in the archives of in the basement of the library for undisturbed for 40 years, until this scholar that they put me in touch with found it, photographed it, and gave a copy to us. So we got to perform bits and pieces of it, and that became Berio's investment in politics, which completed the character.
And every composer in the show had a piece like that. Every composer in the show had a piece through which they were trying to make a social impact in the world, and which was kind of in some way a failure.
Yes. You don't often see a kind of consideration of music history in the form of a concert, which is also a theater piece, which largely focuses on works that didn't succeed. I mean, there are some real hits in there. There are some pieces that everybody, but some of the biggest flops in people's careers. I mean, obviously Berio had to think that was not the way he wanted it to go. Like, this piece just gets buried. Bernstein's Mass, one of the biggest disasters. One of the things that hit me the most strongly about the piece is what it does for Bernstein and the Mass, right? Which is not just a piece that people think isn't a success, but for many people, it's an embarrassment, right? And an embarrassment that sort of resonates in a way that people get embarrassed today. That's how it is. It shows a kind of white privilege. It shows a kind of amateurism about trying to bring rock and other kind of Afro-diasporic music into your compositions, kind of appropriating things. It does all the things that I think would get it canceled today. And it was sort of canceled at the time. And yet, in the context of what you're doing, I think it works.
I'm totally sympathetic with the criticisms, and I think they're absolutely justified. But I think in its time, I think there was a sense, naive, we would look back on it now and say this is absurdly naive, but that art could change the world. I mean, they truly believed that art could actually make a difference to society. And I think if you're coming from that point of view, their attempts to change the world, whether it's through Mass or through Traces or through Hymnen or through, I think came from a place of naive nobility, but laced strongly with, definitely with privilege and with myopia in a way. I mean, it's, ironically, last night I was watching I Am Not Your Negro, the James Baldwin, and you just realize, and this is the same time, that they were all totally, really divorced from the real lived experience of Black Americans. They had no clue what that was actually about, however noble their intentions were. So I think, you know, you have to look at it from the point of this naive, we can change the world through art, and how from a good place that did originally come from, however cloistered, I think maybe a good word to use.
I agree. I agree with all that you said, Nigel. Particularly for me, the Agnus Dei is such an extraordinary piece, and you know, the idea behind it, which is informed by Bernstein's connection to, you know, leftist politics in America, and especially the Catholic left, and Daniel Berrigan in particular, the left-wing priest that he visited in prison as he was working on the Mass. You know, there's this idea of, in our time, meaning his time, well, we don't need a prayer for peace, we need a protest for peace. Like, we're not gonna just pray to bring peace about. We're gonna like get out into the streets and cause trouble and make peace happen. And the way that he realizes that in the Agnus Dei, which is like, you know, it's meant to be music from a kind of street protest. And I've seen it done live. And I don't know, I'm not sure I've ever seen a performance where I felt like it really landed. And it is a moment in 1969 that I'm really proud of, where like, you know, we have, it's the end of Act One, and we're playing the Mass. We're also telling the story of, you know, during the music, we're telling the story of what Bernstein wanted to do with Mass and his idea of it. And we're also, like, you're seeing on the screen all these images of, you know, protests and of the things that were being protested in the 1960s. And the ensemble is both playing their instruments and not just singing, but, you know, like shouting and like actually, you know, being as if part of a peace protest.
I can't even think about the piece critically because I encountered it as a teenager, you know, in the 70s, on the record, the recording. And I mean, that Agnus Dei section terrified me. To me, it takes me back to a time when I was, you know, the early 70s, you know, when I was a pretty vulnerable adolescent, and that piece sort of encoded what it felt like to live through the kind of unraveling period of American history, you know, the sort of Nixon administration and all that. It's a time, you know, I get flashbacks now to that moment, and I think that's something we definitely want to talk about, the sort of topicality of 1969. But yeah, I mean, I think whatever, the fact that the piece was not successful in the moment, I think had to do perhaps because it was too much. It was too good at capturing the kind of centrifugal forces that were sort of tearing things apart. People rejected it because they didn't want it to be true. Yeah. So yeah, the fact that you went for the hardest part of that, the loudest, most complicated part, and brought it in there. So if I remember right, the beginning of Act Two is Jimi Hendrix, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I want to ask a question, and this may lead us into a discussion. As I recall, Jimi Hendrix doesn't say anything in the piece.
Right.
I wonder if you want to, did you consider that? I mean, because that seems to me one of those moments that if one were attempting to sort of say, okay, let's talk about cultural politics. Obviously, the arrangement that you guys do of the Star Spangled Banner and its positioning in the piece is brilliant, I think. But on the other hand, this is a guy who doesn't get to say anything in the.
Yeah, I think we would consider that a major omission now in terms of how we structured it.
I think you're absolutely right. It would be interesting to hear from Jimi Hendrix. And it would be interesting to hear from Angela Davis, for whom John and Yoko wrote a song for her defense fund. So there are definitely points of intersection between our characters and people whose voices we haven't heard in the play.
I think the Hendrix, I felt very strongly that the Hendrix should be there at the very beginning of Act 2, because it seems like a perfect encapsulation of what was going on. I mean, as far as metaphors go, you could not get a better.
It's not just a metaphor. I really think that what you implicitly, and I don't know if this was something you thought about, what you were implicitly saying is something that I try to say in my teaching when I deal with this, that effectively you're positioning Jimi Hendrix as an avant-garde sound artist.
Right.
And his version of the Star Spangled Banner is equivalent to Stockhausen. I think, 1969 is about a series of self-conscious artists. And so they're talking about what they're doing, right? They're very, very self-aware of, well, what does this mean? What am I doing? What's my reaction to the situation? The one sort of masterpiece of Afro-diasporic music is just put there without any kind of self-reflection. So I think you do it justice as a piece of music, but there's a way in which it would be very interesting to ask, what did is there an implication there that Hendrix is different than the other artists, that he just did what he did?
Well, I wonder though, would it be fair to say that the way we present it there is a representation of how he presented it to the world when he performed it, say at Woodstock, without any words, just putting it out there. It spoke for itself, and it was very powerful. It was a rebuke, and he didn't need to announce it. It just by virtue of the way he just threw it down. I don't really think it needed narrative to carry it. So in a way, I think the way that it was positioned at the beginning of the second act is it feels fair to and true to the period and to what he did.
I will note, as the historian, that everybody wanted him to say what that meant. Like he went on the David show, everyone asked him, African-American journalists asked him, and he was asked again and again, what did that mean? What does it mean? And many people don't necessarily know, he played the Star Spangled Banner dozens, if not, almost 100 times. This was not like Woodstock, it was sort of a day at the office right? He always did that. And so there were times when he called the thing that had the improvisation on the Star Spangled Banner, "This is America," right? And in fact, Woodstock's unusual in that he didn't really say anything before he played the Star Spangled Banner. In fact, most of the time when he was doing the Star Spangled Banner, he would introduce it with a short speech or say something. So in fact, he spent a lot of, it's, of course, Hendrix is different. The bell is tolling for us here. Hendrix is different because he's not necessarily someone who wrote, articles in journals, but he did evidently feel like he wanted to position the Star Spangled Banner. It's an interesting moment. Like, I mean, in 1969 version 2, it would be quite possible to find him talking about what he's doing.
When I think about how we develop the script, you're sort of asking, like, Bob, why does he not have lines? And when I think about how we develop the script, it started with this nexus point of Lennon and Stockhausen, and this meeting that we wanted to use as a kind of metaphor for what was happening in the world. And we, sort of looked outward from there to find other artists who were in that network who were like relating to Stockhausen and to John Lennon around these kinds of political and musical issues. That exploration took us to Bernstein, and it took us to Luciano Berio and to Paul McCartney. And we did not go to Black artists during that. And I think if we were to do it now, we would, and honestly, like I can say in all of the, I forgot, I mean, how many hours of conversations do we have about the show, guys? Like hundreds of hours of conversation. And I don't think that was a topic we ever talked about.
No.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think I think we have to. I mean, I think we have to fess up to this in a way that's, I think, very, very specific.
Yep.
I agree with what Alan said. I mean, to be charitable about it, I would say, well, we're focusing on a reactive story, 3 white people's reaction to the war that's going on in Vietnam, to social movements, anti-racist movement, all those things. We're telling the story of 3 or 4 white folks and artists who are reacting to those world historical events and how they dealt with it. In which case, the putting of the Hendrix as this unique moment just by itself kind of is in itself, if you want to call it a rebuke to that narrative, if you could conceive it like that, or, you know, but I think if we were doing this now, I mean, I think partly, if I'm absolutely honest, I think it speaks to our own sense of privilege and that we didn't investigate other narratives. And I think that reflects both on the story we were talking about, but it also, I mean, I can't deny it. It also reflects on us.
Well, I do think, yeah, there's another piece to be written, and I highly encourage you guys to do it, which would start from that Hendrix and move out from there, right? You know, I think maybe one of the other, we can move to a neighboring thematic, which is the sort of high versus low. I do think that I mean, I would have assumed that part of the sort of excitement or of that meeting is the idea that Stockhausen stood for one set of things, one cultural sphere, and Lennon another, right? And the idea that those two would have met is a kind of almost, and the fact that they didn't, you know, is playing around with a kind of bringing together of high and low culture, like a kind of moment of reconciliation of two things that by 1969 were very far apart and have only gotten further apart.
But I think what they were trying to do, whether it's, you know, Mass, which has a rock band and an orchestra and a choir, you know, or, you know, Berio's Beatles songs or whatever. I mean, there is definitely an failed attempt to bring these two strands of popular high and low music together. And I think one of the things that Alan and Andy maybe have said earlier, which I think is important, is that though they were failures at the time, the very fact that a new music ensemble in 2010 or whenever we started this process was able to do that in a concert hall and to play, you know, Revolution 9 and that in itself shows that after the fact, there was a successful, and I mean, now I think it's pretty humdrum for, you know, certainly new music ensembles to explore all kinds of genres and people from what we would call popular music moving into the concert hall. I mean, that's pretty humdrum now. I mean, everybody's doing that, it seems, in a way.
True.
Yeah. I think also, you know, a big change in the musical world that happened between the time of the show and where we are now is minimalism. And I think that minimalism gave popular music and art music a kind of a way to connect that they didn't have before. And I think, you know, that's part of why, you know, in a piece like Mass, the attempt to like push together the avant-garde and popular music feels very awkward, is because they speak such different languages. But now, you know, with minimalism and also with a generation of musicians who grew up like, you know, being, you know, playing in rock bands and, you know, learning how to play Stockhausen and Berio and Steve Reich, I think we're able to make those connections in a much more graceful and organic way than we could back then. And that's kind of that's part of the story that the show is telling, that, you know, these artists dreamed of like saving the world through these very ideologically ambitious pieces. And, you know, and they talk in very grandiose terms about what they wanted to accomplish socially with their music. And well, that didn't happen. You know, they didn't bring together the world through these music. But they did bring together, they helped lay the groundwork for a coming together of different kinds of music.
Yeah, Come Together, song written in 1969. Yeah, and it's interesting to me, that for the artists on both sides of what you would imagine as a great divide, right? The sort of art, pop, whatever that is. It's in the attempt to sort of change the world or the visionary moment, it's the stuff on the other side that seems so exciting, right? So in the sense that Bernstein is attempting to get the energy, he's the one who had said a few years before Mass, well, what the Beatles are doing is way more interesting to me than anything that's happening in contemporary composition. At the same time, you can tell that someone like John Lennon is just, he meets Yoko Ono, and this world of sort of avant-garde performance art, and the idea that you could do a tape collage and just put anything into it, to him seems like absolute freedom. In other words, I mean, I think he's as kind of in love with almost romanticizing the thing that he's not familiar with, as maybe Bernstein was about sort of rock music. So there's one of the things I thought was very poignant about the piece was the idea that not so much that people had these dreams which weren't going to be realized, but that there's the grass is always greener on the other side of the cultural fence, that you could have, because from the perspective of Beatles fans, trust me, Yoko Ono is a total failure. She's still a controversial figure, and nobody wants to listen to Revolution 9, right? That when the Beatles doing that is, even though they could not have a higher reputation, their fans didn't accept that part.
Right.
Really, they blame Yoko Ono for that, and they sort of people skip over Revolution 9 on the last side of the White Album.
I think one of the triumphs of 1969 is Matt Marks's his orchestration of Revolution 9, which I think is a masterpiece actually of orchestration. I think, and not only is it just geniusly put together in his mind and therefore realized, but it speaks also, this whole, it's sort of what something that Andy touched on is that it's this meeting of analog and electronic in a way that is you see live in front of you, done with such skill and joy that it's sort of not only does hearing it do something to you, if you like, it's like you're hearing it for the first time, but you're also engaged watching it as a performative act, which is so exciting to watch. I remember the first time I saw it, and I was just like, blown away by what the musicians were doing. But it's also, again, kind of like the Hendrix piece. It serves as a metaphor for the whole evening in a way. This sort of between this movement between genres and between times and between structures. I think that's what's also so genius about it.
But there's a way in which, when Revolution Number 9 is about your group and what it can do, right? And it's imposing your own kind of aesthetics on that. I don't know whether you felt there were other moments where you thought, okay, this is really about, us taking a stand, what we think.
Yeah, I think, we have a really specific place in the show, which is that, the show is about the coming together that didn't happen, which is the, sort of social transformation and also the actual meeting between Lennon and Stockhausen. And it's also about the coming together that did happen, which is the musical coming together. And I think we see ourselves as representing that. Yeah, and then also, the piece that then, comes at the very end of the show, which is Stefan Frein's meeting piece, is also like, that is very much our inserting ourselves into the narrative. And expressing the musical coming together that came out of the pioneering work that these artists did. And I think you were asking about how we might feel differently about that now than when we made it. And I think a way that I feel really differently is that the notion that I think is sort of in the story that we tell, that the musical coming together is a meaningful achievement um, and a kind of and is a triumph of these artists' struggles, even though the sort of social change that they wanted to make didn't really happen. That felt more comfortably like a kind of happy ending for the show to me when we first made it than it does now. Now living in an age when like when we were making the show, we were looking back on the riots and the stress and the feeling of the world coming apart that was happening in the late 1960s. And now we feel very much in that again. And so, making a show like 1969 and putting forward the musical coming together as a kind of, I won't quite say happy ending, but
I think you're right, yeah.
Yeah, that just feels
resolution, a positive revolution, an optimistic resolution of what can happen. I mean, that it was happy in that sense. It was very optimistic, and I think there's very little reason to be optimistic these days.
But at the time, there wasn't a lot of reason to be optimistic then. Like what Berio was saying 50 years ago is something that he could say right now, and probably would, which is that we tried to change the world, we tried to stop the wars. Our music couldn't do it. So what do? Well, you keep on going on. I mean, as he borrowed from Beckett, and he could. It really does feel the same way now that it did 50 years ago. But things are going to hell. What difference does music make? What does the artist do? Is the artist to do nothing? What is a composer? What is a musician supposed to do now? Is there meaning to what the musician does? Is there meaning to music if it can't change the world? And Berio would say yes, and he said it then, and I think he would say the same thing now. Don't you, Alan? Do you think that he would? What do you think he would make of things now if he were transported into this day and age?
I don't know that I'm ready. I don't know that I can hazard a guess at that. I know Berio well enough. Nigel,
Yeah.
I definitely wouldn't hazard a guess at that. I think the day and age we find ourselves in leaves everything up for grabs.
Yeah.
Well, it's. I mean, we do have evidence because here we are, right? The discussions that are happening in the same nexus are quite different.
Yeah.
Right? In that, I don't think anybody, and this may be a bad thing, it may be a good thing, but I don't think that most people are reaching for sort of cultural fusion as the solution to the problems that we are having now. Like the recurrence of 1969 in the current moment hasn't led people to imagine grand cultural fusions or a kind of hybridity, right? If 1969, the piece that you did, leaves something in my mind, it's that I do get a little nostalgic for that kind of fuzzy-headed idealism, the idea that like maybe one guy, and it is a guy, right? Maybe one guy could actually open up enough to let everything in and sort of let it come through him and out the other side. I mean, yeah. I mean, if there was anybody in American history who you could have imagined doing it, would have been Leonard Bernstein, right?
Absolutely.
And the fact,
right. He wanted to embrace the whole world in his music.
Mm-hmm.
I think that his impulse to do that is entirely genuine and entirely sincere. And certainly like, in a work like Mass, which is maybe his sort of most ambitious attempt at that, like not entirely successful and, by contemporary standards, problematic in a lot of ways. But I think there is the feeling of loss that I also feel looking at, the 1969 story, is that this really like brash idealism of all of these artists about what they could achieve socially, politically, in their music seems so naive now.
Yeah.
well, naive is, I mean, it may seem naive. I mean, what you can objectively say is nobody has I was going to use a different word, but I think it would hard pressed to imagine someone having the guts to try that now. And that may be a kind of humility, a cultural humility that's necessary, right? But it also feels like kind of a little bit of a loss. You know what I mean? on the one hand, it is probably good that no one person who embodies one kind of positionality or intersectionality is going to speak for everyone, right? On the other hand, you know, I think
but it flies in the face of what one wishes to believe, that
Yeah.
we all share commonality and that we can thus be, but that's not, certainly not the moment we live in. And so I think that's, I don't know, it's a question that should be interrogated for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's what, yeah, that I think that is a fair, that's a good point to bring up. I mean, that one of the sort of tragic tensions in 1969 is you're talking about a moment which feels very familiar because everything is splintering and it's highly polarized. And yet the protagonists of your story are really trying to bring it all together, right? So they're trying to imagine, like, what if I could sort of get everything in my piece?
Yeah.
And that, yeah, they're yeah, I think it's correct and interesting to associate that with a kind of liberal
Yeah.
ideal, but also just the idea that this way of working, you know, could be a way of really attempting to explore all other different kinds of issues. You know, this one was organized around a particular historical moment, you know, which is pivotal. But
Right.
the beauty of 1969 is it brings all of its, you know, program notes, if you will, with it in a way that doesn't feel, and I feel this very consciously as a kind of teacher type, right, that doesn't feel like a lecture.
Right.
You know,
Absolutely.
I've done plenty of pre-concert lectures, and you try to make them interesting, but they are a lecture. And this is a work of art which has a teaching function in it. And now that you've created this kind of form in a way, you could point it at any number of things. You know, gender,
Yeah, no,
sexuality.
Really beautifully said, and that's exactly I love how perfectly you put that. That's exactly the intention of the form.
Well, bringing it back to the ostensible subject, yeah, this makes me understand more why this moment in time seems so important to you guys, right? Yes, obviously it represents a kind of rapprochement of different types of music, which are now all part of the grist for the mill of the music that you guys work with. But it's also, it's a way, it's a kind of radical openness, you know, and I think, yes, that even in this sort of relatively dark moment, I think it's worth holding on to that. I mean, I think one looks back at 1969 with less optimism politically, I think, than in any other moment in my adult life right now. I haven't totally given up. I believe, you know, I still believe, but in terms of the kind of openness and willingness to take risks and chances that artists are showing, I'm pretty optimistic. So, you know, I do think that that your happy ending isn't completely vitiated, because one needs to be aware of both the political and, if you will, the aesthetic notions of freedom, right? I think political freedom seems very contingent right now, but I think you can tell a pretty good story about artistic freedom. You know, the heirs of Stockhausen and Berio are out there.
Yeah, that's right. And it is sort of our origin story in a way. There's a way in which, because of that theme of artistic freedom, that 1969 is kind of Alarm Will Sound's origin story.
Right. Well, thank you.
That's a great final cadence. That's a great place to sort of end.
Yeah.
And you know, I hope people who watch the video of what you of this show have the same kind of experience I had, because perhaps because of my generational identity and because of my previous history with some of the pieces, I found it intensely moving and almost too intense. So it's, yeah, if you're gonna, those of you who are watching this, if you're watching this, you know, sit down and focus, because it's gonna grab you, and it's actually it's going to mess with your mind
In a good way.
in a good way.